Welcome. Thank you for joining us today here at our Science Exploration Series. And my name is Dina Farrell, and I work in Marketing Communications in the College of Science. And I also teach a course here on campus in Science Communications. First, I wanted to thank the Alumni Association for the use of this beautiful space. We've had this series now for about 9 to 10 years, and historically we've offered it over at Jordan Hall of Science. But we had the chance to partner with the Alumni Association this year, and I'm super excited about that. I wanted to direct you after this presentation. We've got several hands-on science activities in the backyard area here at Eck. Please make sure you take time to check those out. I know that our professor of public understanding of science, Kate Bieberdorf, known as Kate the Chemist, helped student groups set up some really fun stuff for y'all to work on. While today's talk is happening in the morning, most of these talks will be at 3 p.m. on the Friday before every home game, so you can kind of mark that on your calendar if you're someone who comes to the games frequently. And we've got some flyers on either side here if you want to just keep those with you, take a look at what we have to offer, for future games. So this is our first, obviously, science exploration event for this year. And as you can see from the slideshow, we have several different talks planned, from grasslands to planets. There's a little bit of something for everyone. One of our talks is going to be back over at Jordan Hall of Science because it's in our newly remodeled digital visualization theater, which is essentially a planetarium. So when you look at the schedule, be sure not to miss that one because it's all new, it's all upgraded. It's going to be pretty cool, that one as well. Today's speaker is Dr. Ryan Sensenig, and he is a professor of the practice in the Department of Biological Sciences. And his research focuses on integrating fire ecology into both savanna grasslands in Kenya and reconstructed tallgrass prairies here in Indiana. Before working at Notre Dame, he was the chair of the biology department at Goshen College. And there he worked as a professor and director of the Environmental and Marine Science program until 2023. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sensenig.
Thanks, Dina. It's great to be here. Thanks for coming. The weather is so nice, I don't even understand why you're in this room. I mean, walking around outside seems like it would be a good alternative activity. As a restoration ecologist, I currently work in both a Kenya savanna system in the foothills of Mount Kenya, but I also have projects here in Indiana in the tallgrass prairies of this part of the world. But I haven't always been a restoration ecologist. I spent my childhood growing up chasing wildlife around in the hinterlands of Kenya. Spent much of my childhood there, and eventually then went to get my PhD to study grassland conservation from a very conservation mindset. And it wasn't until I came to the Midwest, to Indiana, that I began to see the contrast between these two habitats that I had grown to love. Of course, in Indiana, we don't have many of our native grasslands left, and that is what, in turn, convinced me to jump into the field of restoration ecology. I've begun to explore these two different habitats with my students, and as a part of that process, I have really begun to become convinced that the opportunity to do tallgrass restoration can help us more understand what it means to be human. In fact, I think AJ, in that picture there, is sitting right over here, so thanks, AJ, for coming. So my talk today is going to be divided into 3 very short chapters. I'm hoping that we have about 10 minutes at the end that we can have some discussion about these ideas. These are chapters of what I would argue are chapters of the human story. So we're going to first talk about human grassland coevolution. We're going to then shift into talking about the Anthropocene, or the Great Unraveling. And we're going to end with the whole point of today, talking a little bit more about restoration ecology. So the story of humans is in part a story of grasslands. And this story starts with humans in in about 1 million years ago, Homo sapiens about 200,000 years ago, starting to manage the landscape using fire. We were, in fact, elemental in opening up landscapes that created these grassland systems. And as a result, these systems then also became abundantly filled with large grazers. These large grazers co-evolved along with our human communities. So today, each of us, we carry this story in our genes. It is in this environment that you're well aware of, perhaps, as these food resources became much more abundant, human cognition increased and grew through time. So over a 5 million year period, you can see us there in the upper right-hand corner, how our brain sizes increased. The point I also want to make is this brain size increase, dependent on the foods that were being produced in these large animals, it also facilitated our consciousness. So as early hunter-gatherers were trying to find food, they had to begin to think about how they were going to collaborate together. How they were not only going to find rare food, but how they were going to subdue it and how they were going to make use of it for their own survival. I would also argue that it was in that system, as consciousness grew, that humans also evolved what I'm going to call a proto-moral system. In other words, they became more aware of themselves as related to other creatures. They had to do this to be able to survive in this particular landscape. So the traits they gathered were both cooperative traits and competitive traits. And I think we owe a debt of gratitude to our ancestors for surviving in this challenging environment. Some of our colleagues would suggest that it even affected our predisposition. So I want you to take a look at this image, and in 10 seconds, I want you to tell me which panel you find most aesthetically pleasing, and we're going to vote. So you have about 5 seconds left. You chose panel A, raise your hand. You chose panel B, raise your hand. C and D. Okay, so the data support what you concluded in our little data gathering set. There are papers published about this. It's called the savanna hypothesis. The idea is that we each have even a predisposition to aesthetic preferences because 95% of human evolution was in grassland systems, not in these agricultural systems that most of us are much more familiar with. The story goes on. Around 20,000 years, humans arrived to the North American context, and in that environment, they began to manage tallgrass prairie communities, which is really what I would like to talk about today. Indigenous communities also used fire to manage these prairies, and the reasons they were using fire varied. Sometimes they were actually using fire to drive large game, like is done in East Africa. You may not be as familiar with this large game, but these were our Pleistocene megafauna that used to be roaming around Kansas and Oklahoma. They may have also used fire to create open habitat so that it wouldn't close in and become a forest. They liked open habitat for a variety of reasons, to grow grasses that they could use in their own commerce, but also probably to help them see enemies coming from a distance. In northern Indiana, about 15% of our habitat we think was tallgrass prairie. So we call this the Prairie Peninsula. Those of you who are from Indiana are probably fairly familiar with this. You can even find South Bend up there on the border. And if you look closely into the historical data, indeed, even on the Notre Dame campus in 1830, the early public land surveyors found prairie in this habitat. So we are in part of the prairie country here. Grasslands have continued, as we all know, to serve human communities for a long time. And partly that is because grasslands receive less rain than forests, and they put a lot of their biomass, in fact, in many cases, 80% of their biomass below ground. That also makes them tolerant to fire, tolerant to herbivory, things that large grazers can't damage as compared to forests. This is also why, not surprisingly, that we've lost most of our grasslands in the United States, because for thousands of years, the prairies were creating really deep, rich nutrient soil. We found, as modifiers of the environment, just like our ancestors, we could use that deep, dark, rich organic soil to grow crops. That leads us to chapter 2. So now we've just gone through about 150,000 years in a few minutes. Okay? Chapter 2 is the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene, you could be thought of as the Great Unraveling. It's thought to start in about 1950, when human communities are known geologically to have influenced, maybe irreversibly in some contexts, the ecological communities we depend on. What I want to mention, though, is the difference between us and our ancestors is probably twofold. One, we have more powerful tools to manage the environment, to subdue the resources around us. The silver lining is we're also more aware of that, probably, than our ancestors were. You could think of this metaphorically. We have left the garden. We're in the process of leaving the garden. And the subduing of the garden has come with benefits, but it's also come with some challenges. So as an ecologist, I want to talk interdisciplinarily with you today. I want to share 3 things that I think are baked in to how nature works. These thoughts could be thought of as philosophical conclusions, even theological conclusions, if you will. The first one is this: evolution as a creative force, in fact, that's how we all came to be, is dependent on things going wrong for some creatures. Said another way, in order for some creatures to flourish, other creatures must disappear. This is true for species in a geologic time scale. 99% of all of our species that have ever graced the planet are extinct. And so their heritage is in the story that they give to other future species that come later. So our success, in a sense, as the human story connects to this idea, has come at the expense of other species. The second idea, I think, that's kind of baked into ecology, evolution kind of principles, is that creation, evolution spawns species which have a me-centric view. This probably makes sense to you because without it, they might end up in the waste heap of extinction, as I just mentioned. But I also want you to be cautious. A me-centric view doesn't mean you're not collaborative. Evolutionary ecological principles lead to lots of collaboration and cooperation. That can aid in survival. And this is particularly true, of course, for human communities, too. This graph shows our relationship with the megaherbivores. So at the bottom, in Africa, humans evolved 200,000 years ago in Africa. And as you can see through time, the current is on the right-hand side there. Most of the African wildlife remained extant. They're still there. I study them when I go to Kenya every year. In contrast, in Eurasia, humans arrived much more recently at the red arrow. And after their arrival there, we lost most of our megaherbivores. And this pattern repeats in North America. That's why you didn't know those Pleistocene megafauna on the previous slide, or were less familiar with them. This happens in Madagascar and other places where humans weren't found until more recently. So this suggests that humans and megaherbivores co-evolved together, and when they were together, they could coexist. But when they came together more recently with human technologies, things unraveled. The last point, nature at some scales is a zero-sum game. By that I mean, not all creatures can have a good day at the same time. We raise chickens on our farm, and so, when the fox's belly is full of our chickens, the fox is having a good day, we're having less of a good day. So there's always a kind of an ecological reaction to things that are done on the planet. And in this case, the diagram shows what remnant prairie we have left, and it's probably even a little less than what you're seeing here after humans took landscapes and made them productive for themselves. So the desire to control our world, like our ancestors controlled grasslands, I would argue it seems kind of elemental to our nature, and that's okay. Today, you and I, we work hard to have the days, the weeks, the months kind of come into submission to our plans. Some of us are A-type personalities. We like things to be organized. With enough effort, the world bends to the will of the human machinery. We create order out of chaos. Resources are always on the shelf. Water flows from our taps. The diseases that threaten us are subdued. And our children are getting jobs and retirement funds are yielding yields, etc. And all this feels good for a time, until what feels right for us becomes dangerously wrong for so many others. So Obviously, we know the flip side of this. Many bodies of water are not potable any longer. We currently risk losing about a third of a species to extinction. And even our chronic preoccupation with thriving sometimes leaves us feeling empty, even perhaps depressed. So there's the contrast I'm trying to raise. We're the most successful, long-lived, thriving human generation the planet has ever seen, but we're also more aware of our impact on the planet than probably any other generation. Well, this leads me to the hopeful part of this, the last chapter, restoring relationships. So in this regard, I want to introduce you to a theologian that I find connects to some of my work in restoration ecology. As life systems are created, if you agree with me that life systems are created via these relationships, these tensions, this desire to both kind of control, but also be controlled, and you're also controlled by nature around you, it leads to the opportunity for an ethical realization. And I'm going to call that a kenotic morality. George Ellis calls it a kenotic ethics. That is the practice of self-emptying to make space and wholeness for the entire system that you're living in or other creatures that are dependent upon that system. So, go back to my three big ideas. I would argue for a kenotic morality to develop, the only thing you need is a set of creatures who are aware that they're in one of these systems, that they start to be aware of an other. They start to be aware of their effects on that system. And then you become exposed to a grand moral moment. In fact, others, theologians and folks have much more expertise in this area could comment on this, but I would even guess that if evolution is the common way creatures are formed in our universe, that moral systems develop everywhere too. Because as cognition and complexity of thought develops, so does your awareness of the other, the creatures around you, so to speak. So, what will be our next chapter in this human environment story? We're living in it. We can decide. We get to influence it. So I'm going to be very narrow now. I'm going to talk about just my area and maybe think about areas that your work might also parallel this idea. I'm going to ask, can the restoration of grasslands help us become more human? And I'm not even defining what being more human is. I'm hoping we can discuss that a little bit in a few minutes. I believe it can be. So the act of ecological restoration, I think, can be an example of a kenotic morality. A dance, really, between controlling but also restraining and trying to figure out when to do each of those activities. So this is a picture of Little Blue Stem Farm. 6 years ago, my wife and I converted this from a soy and cornfield into a tallgrass prairie. And it required a lot of kenosis. We first had to decide what seed we were going to buy, and that was not cheap. We found a local agency to do that. We had to engage people in removing the non-native vegetation. This is from a different prairie, but in this case, we did it fairly aggressively. Then we had to plant, and that turned into a really social gathering. Here we're scattering seed like you would see in Old Testament kind of visualizations. And then the first year, it's going to look horrible. This is from the parish prairie, which is just down St. Mary's Road right here on Notre Dame campus. This prairie was planted this winter, and it's already being mowed. It looks like weeds because it is. Almost 90% of those plants there are non-native invasive weeds. But you can see one signal of hope, little black-eyed Susan cropping up in the middle there. So this prairie will need to be mowed for about 2 years to knock back the non-natives, and after that time period, we're going to be able to start burning it. This is a burn at my farm. We have an experiment going on there. We burn parts of it every year. And then you wait. As this whole process unfolds, there is a whole series of watching and waiting. In the beginning, the pioneer species like black-eyed Susan come in, and eventually a few grasses. And then it won't be for 5 or 6 years till a species like prairie dock. This has a massive leaf. It digs about a 12-foot taproot before it even sets a flower up. And we won't see the monarchs and the bees until the milkweed starts to flourish. And so the restitching together, the connectivity of the entire system, is this opportunity for us to relate in a more kenotic way. There are times we have to engage, There are times we have to manage invasives and burn, and then there are times we have to wait and watch. I want to tell you a quick story about an example of this lesson for me. We are also trying to reintroduce Pleistocene megaherbivores to our farm, and I'd like you to introduce you to our herd. One of the joys of having a small herd of 5 or 6 cattle is that occasionally new birth comes to your farm. So I want to tell you a story about our most recent arrival. Down there on the right, that calf is named Aster. We named Aster after a common flower in the prairie, but it turned out later the name served a dual purpose. I was so frustrated with managing Aster that it felt helpful to occasionally relieve my stress by saying how much she was a pain in my Aster. And the reason is, to the unschooled farmer, I don't have a deep background in farming, Aster would disappear under the electric line and go to the far edge of the prairie. I didn't know where she was. Calf's supposed to be with mama. I'd go trudging around for a half hour. I'd find Aster. I'd lovingly carry Aster back to mama, right? And then next night she did it again. On day 2 of her life, we got about a 50-degree rainy night, and she disappeared completely for 24 hours. We assumed we were gonna lose her that night. Sure enough, next morning, we find her, made her way back to mama, bellowing for milk, and all was right. What I learned through that is that my exercise in trying to restitch the system back together was futile because I didn't understand it. I should have watched, I should have waited, I should have restrained my behavior in that regard. I think this metaphor goes to many areas of our lives. I think in our society we have forgotten an important truth. As a result of living in these very complex systems, like our ancestors used to live in, we're no longer living in direct connection with nature. And so we don't have this opportunity to kind of ask ourselves, when do I engage and when do I restrain? Whereas indigenous communities, ancestral communities, were forced to do that. So I think there's much wisdom that relies in that simple idea of, if we have to constantly ask ourselves, when do I engage in the system? When do I move it towards a direction I think is hopeful? And when do I pull back? When do I create opportunities for other creatures to flourish? I'll end with how my research has also been a humbling and engaging process of noticing and watching and waiting. We're doing it both in the Indiana prairies, and we're doing it on, this is a drone video of some burning that I'm involved in and leading in the Kenya savanna. And in both of these environments, we're trying to let nature help us understand what are the correct ways to engage this system. One of our goals is to figure out if we can create a prairie habitat or a savanna habitat that sequesters carbon. And so we've modified both burning and grazing. In the bottom axis, you see areas where we've let all the wildlife. The red indicates soil samples we gathered in burn sites, and the aqua soil samples that we've gathered in unburned sites. And the response variable here is % carbon. We're measuring how much carbon these deep prairie roots put back into the soil. And what we're learning is if you do nothing as a human engager, you get the least amount of carbon. So grazing and burning both tend to increase carbon, but not if you do them together. In other words, it's complex. The ecological community that we're connected to deserves our patient, humble waiting and watching. Another way we're doing this is by burying clear, translucent root viewing tubes called mini rhizotrons. The video on the left is actually AJ helping me install one of these tubes. The video that's starting now is us hammering this clear tube into the Kenyan savanna, and then we go back with a special camera that fits down into the tube and take photographs. And we're trying to use this information to understand if fire and grazing influence carbon, how are they doing it? Are they doing it via influencing the root growth? And does the root growth then in turn influence microbial species growth? And is that where the carbon is being stored? It's a complex system that we're trying to untangle. So let's conclude, back to our original question. How have I reflected? And I'm going to just be personal here. If it's irrelevant to your experience, I want to hear about it. I've needed then to reflect on what doing restoration ecology can offer us personally, in addition to what we can offer nature. So one of my favorite days of the year is prescribed burning, and it's because it builds community, human community. You have to collaborate together, train together, you cover each other, watch each other's back, etc. It's engaging in an activity that depends on community. We're probably all aware that native plants offer pollinator services that can remind us that we need to practice reciprocity as human communities. We can't control everything. We need to release space for another creature to give a gift back to us. And learning which species to remove from the system. So this is the parish prairie a year ago. I showed you the parish prairie that was being mowed. This is when it was filled with a tree called Callery pear. Many of you have maybe seen Callery pear in your neck of the woods, highly invasive tree. So Bradford pear or Callery pears, they all had to be removed. So how does that help us maybe atone for our past scientific mistakes? And then, thematically, how can we think about climate justice? Is it possible that by deepening our habitat roots here in North America, we can address the fact that my Kenyan colleagues are experiencing the effects of climate change? They're experiencing longer droughts and more severe droughts, largely due to this kind of dismantling of the Anthropocene's effect on habitats all over the world, not just in Indiana. So I'll conclude here by just arguing for the point that I think we need these human communities, whether they're faith-based, academic, business communities. We have to collaboratively work together to think about how ecological and sociological, perhaps even theological benefits might ensue through some pulling back, through some restraint. But in the same breath, I think we're going to get more. We're going to connect with each other better. We're going to feel inspired with our work. And we're going to perhaps feel like we can make contributions to future generations. We want to be good ancestors to future. So I will end just simply saying, I think we find ourselves in this generation with a defining human kenotic moral moment, and we just need to kind of think about what we will do. I would invite you to help me do some prairie restoration, but you probably have an example of this theme in your own lives. So I would love to have some time for questions, or if you want to share how you're finding healing or hope in your own reconnections with natural systems, I would love to have you share that with all of us.
If you have a question, I'll pass the microphone around. I ask that if you are able to stand up, that would be great. That way our video folks can get you on camera. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Yeah.
Thank you. I had a question. I've noticed in some of the habitats around here, there's an invasive species, I think, called the tree of heaven. Could you talk a little bit about maybe how dangerous that would be, or just the impacts of that specific invasive species on the environment in South Bend?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Tree of heaven is a problem. Tree of heaven, I've never seen bigger tree of heaven than on my fence row at my farm than when I first bought it. I had about 5 of them this big around. It's taken me 2 or 3 years to get control of their roots that adventitiously push up new. So it's a challenge. I want to tie it together with fire. Like in this part of the world, without fire, these systems would return to forests aside from invasive plants, right? So they were maintained as open areas by indigenous burning practices that we're now continuing as management practices. But then when you add non-natives, invasives on top of that, tree of heaven just being one of them, it becomes even more essential for us to kind of return those key disturbances to the system. I'm not particularly worried about tree of heaven in terms of taking over prairies, because we know how aggressive it is and we know how to control it, but it takes watching and noticing and becoming aware of the first one, so you go get it in time. Yeah.
I think I saw a question on this side. Yes. my steps in.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask a quick question. With climate change, you looked at the historical map of some of these prairies. Are you looking to restore where they have been or evolve into new areas?
Great question. So I'm teaching a restoration ecology class right now, and we hit this theme almost every week. We can't go back to a pristine baseline to think about restoring. We no longer have that option. So for example, if we're doing oak savanna restoration in Indiana, we want to get black oak acorns from south of us and plant that genetic material. So yeah, your point is a really important one. I would also say Nature Conservancy has suggested that northern Indiana in particular will become increasingly a prairie state, not an eastern deciduous oak hickory climax community. So yeah, I think it's thinking about, by the way, that perfectly underlines for me why this is so inviting. If it were just a postcard mentality of let's think about what used to be and let's just put a fence up, take humans out of it, and it'll heal itself and go back what used to be. That probably was never true ecologically, and because of invasive species and climate change now, it's for sure not true. So what it means is we are morally obligated to think about any action, and no action is an action. So what we're not doing is still going to have an effect, right? And so it basically says to the environmental movement, humans have made mistakes, but the system needs us. Like, it's so much more invitational to me because you have to proactively plan. But it also is so much more moral to me because we don't actually know what the results are going to be. And it's humbling, right? But I think we need that for society, but also I think for science, yeah.
Hi, I'm from Dallas, Texas, and I'm very concerned about blackland prairie restoration. And yesterday I went to Niles, Michigan, to Fernwood, and saw their tallgrass prairie. Do you have visitors at your farm?
I always welcome visitors. In fact, I wanted to point out, I lost a few minutes of time. Oh, it actually is this photo. The gentleman on the far right attended a talk I gave a couple months ago, and he said, "Do you ever have visitors come to your farm?" I said, "Yeah, do you want to be on the burn list?" He said, "Sure." So he's on the burn list. I called him up, said, "Hey, we're going to burn tomorrow." And he came. He had never helped out with prescribed burning before. So yeah, I think that's partly what I mean by this as an opportunity for social engagement. It's an invitation not to do it independently, but to do it collaboratively. I'll share my information with you if you'd like to come. Did you?
Let me give you the microphone that we can hear you well.
Is there a restoration project on campus?
The question is there a restoration project on campus? Yeah, there are multiple ones, though they're small and nascent and developing. None of them have been burned yet or managed with some of the processes we'd use for bigger prairies that are less proximal to buildings. The most recent one is the photographs I was showing you. I call it the parish prairie. The Fathers of Holy Cross have about 30 acres that they put into a short mix of low-profile species.
Across the street.
Right next to the cemetery on St. Mary's Road, right across from that.
Oh, okay.
That's the youngest one. And then there are a few others that are maybe 1 or 2 acres in size. I think the oldest is maybe 8 or 9 years.
Do we have to do environmental act or something?
In order to get permission to do it? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, sometimes you have to get.
So this is a good thing to conclude on. These commitments are communal commitments. And so, while I might think the God Quad, God would approve of a prairie in front of the God Quad, that's going to be a hard sell, right? That's probably not going to work. But so what are we willing to give up? What are we willing to release? And why are we releasing it? It's extremely complex and extremely invitational. This is what made me leave the gloom of the Anthropocene. I saw it more as opportunity, where you can start to have these conversations. So I'm a relative new professor at Notre Dame. We have about 10 acres of prairie at my previous institution that we put in. And so one of my goals was to where can my students go to study and do this? So I had to figure out who am I going to talk to, who's on my who am I going to preach to the choir about so that we get them on board? And it does take time to do that. Yeah.
Thank you again, Dr. Sensenig. If you have time, be sure to go to the backyard area here for all of the hands-on science activities, and have a great weekend.